Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, getting ready to work with a new Democrat-led administration in Washington, D.C. that will assume office in January next year. India on Sunday congratulated victorious Democrat presidential candidate Joe Biden, who will be the next president of the United States. Both Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Ramnath Kovind tweeted congratulatory messages for the successful duo of Biden and Kamala Harris on Sunday shortly after midnight. India had on Friday said that the comprehensive global strategic partnership between both the nations has very strong bipartisan support in the US, thereby hinting that bilateral ties would continue to grow stronger. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze what the change of guard in the United States means for India and the world. Joining me on the program today are Yashwant Raj, US correspondent of the Hindustan Times, Richard Rosso, senior advisor, US-India Policy Studies, CSIS, and Praveen Krishna, professor, Johns Hopkins University. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Praveen Krishna, let me begin the program with you first. Let me congratulate you for calling the election rightly on the previous edition of The Big Picture, or 5 days ago when you said that Joe Biden would be the next president of the United States. What changes now?
Well, first, there's it's great to have this kind of resolution of the uncertainty as to who the president was going to be. As far as policy changes and as far as India is concerned, I suspect that the first many months of the Biden administration will be sort of preoccupied, the administration will be preoccupied with dealing with a whole range of very important internal issues. The COVID crisis, which is in a sense accelerating or increasing in its intensity, the economic implications of this that the administration will have to consider carefully and deal with. For instance, trying to get funding for fiscal stimulus and negotiations with Congress and so forth, along with other major foreign policy priorities that the administration will want to deal with. My sense is that as far as India is concerned and what might change with respect to Biden administration relative to Trump administration, U.S.-India relations are, of course, important, very significant, but may not be at the very top of the priority list in terms of what the incoming administration has to deal with. And they may well choose to maintain some degree of stability for a while before turning to see what they might change or where they might sort of push ahead, cut back, recalibrate the relationship.
Absolutely. Richard, that's a very important point that Praveen has just raised. What's going to be the key focus area really as far as the president-elect is concerned? The top three focus areas probably in the next 6 months.
It's going to be important to find a pathway through the COVID crisis, trying to double down in terms of the steps that individuals should take, that states should consider, looking for, of course, hopefully some type of medical solution as well, which hopefully is not too far away before we can begin, covering the wider population in the United States. So COVID is certainly going to be part of it. Finding a way to balance that with the economy is going to be crucial. But there's a lot of, I think, damaged international relations that we do have to begin to repair sooner rather than later. And the fact that, maybe the president himself may not have as much time to spend, as Praveen rightly pointed out, there's going to be a lot of time spent on domestic issues. But you will have a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of State, and others who will be charged with international relationships. And I suspect you're going to see them deployed sooner rather than later to try to make sure that our key relationships with NATO, with Japan, and others are back on an even keel sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. I'm going to take that up with the other panelists as well in just a bit about what's likely to happen as far as the WHO is concerned, the Paris Climate Accord, and all those other major organizations that the US has withdrawn from. But before that, Yashwant Raj, as far as Trump's policies are concerned, are they going to continue as far as the Biden administration, along with the Biden administration? What is he likely to take forward?
First, thanks for having me here. And let's begin with the good news. I think Pfizer has just announced they have their vaccine is tested, is proven 90% effective. So, and FDA had set a 50% mark for approving an effective vaccine. So I think there is good news on that front. The announcement just came in the morning. So I think with that out of the way, on foreign policy, there is usually continuity unless something surprises. And as you know, there is a tendency for things to happen on foreign policy that you can't anticipate all the time. But there is going to be continuity from what the Trump administration was doing, and on foreign policy. But there might be changes on other issues such as immigration, and where President-elect Biden had earlier indicated there will be changes. There is already talk about him revoking Trump's travel ban on certain people from certain Muslim majority countries. Then restoring protection for undocumented immigrants brought as children, which is DACA. So there will be changes on immigration and other issues, but foreign policy will continue for a while till President Biden is able to get onto it. As Praveen and Rick both pointed out, it will have to be further down the road.
Okay. All right. Taking the discussion forward, then let's go back first to go forward. Praveen, when Joe Biden was the vice president, he spoke about taking the Indo-US trade to $500 billion. So clearly, that could be a focus area, and a trade deal between the two nations has been elusive in the past. Can we see or can we expect some kind of solution on the trade front in the months to come?
That's a great question. Now, clearly, India-US trade is not at the $500 billion mark, probably about a third of that at this point. And I think it's great to aspire for greater integration, more international trade, and so forth. But as far as a more comprehensive trade deal between India and the US is concerned, I suspect that there isn't a great appetite on the Indian side for a very comprehensive deal, which would require very substantial liberalization of international trade on the Indian side. And I'm not so sure that there's going to be great appetite on the other side of the US either for a very substantial trade deal with India. There are important constituencies. There are great concerns here about the deindustrialization of the US, about the pressure that workers in the US have come under, especially in some of these swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, et cetera. Over the last decade, 2 decades, there's a sense that greater international trade with China is what has created these economic and political pressures in these areas. And so I think they would approach any discussion of a kind of a real trade deal or a substantial trade deal with India with a great sort of sense of caution. That said, there are many margins where there could be improvements. There could be rationalization of the kind of policies that India has in place, that the US has in place, especially with respect to agricultural trade and restrictions on agricultural trade and so forth, where tariffs tend to be higher than what they are otherwise. So that I would hope to see some movement along those lines. It would be great if there were kind of discussion that begins about a truly a more substantial trade deal, but I suspect we're some distance away from that.
Right. So let's talk about the strategic partnership then, Richard. We've seen in the recent past, the Quad taking up a firmer shape. We've seen the Malabar exercise as well. And since Praveen brought up China, do you believe that, we're going to see continuity as far as the Quad is concerned, like-minded democracies working together, especially in the Indo-Pacific? What is, the Biden administration's thinking towards the Indo-Pacific going to be like?
Yeah, I suspect that you won't see a huge difference in our engagement in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, it goes back to the Obama administration where you saw the pivot or the rebalance. Now, I think originally India didn't figure very prominently in that because at the time it was announced, it was just on the heels of the U.S. losing the MMRCA Medium Multi-Role Combat Aircraft Agreement, as well as the kind of failure of the U.S.-India Civilian Nuclear Accord because of the relatively weak liability law that was passed in Parliament. So, at the time of the pivot or rebalance, India had kind of fallen out of favor for a bit there. But, it's firmly back into place. And when you talk about issues like the Quad, which had kind of been on the back burner for quite some time, now suddenly you've got a lot of momentum. All 4 countries are working, able to come to agreement much better than they were before. You don't want to ignore a new grouping like that actually has really the muscle to push back as we begin to see a more aggressive China. COVID was that moment, when perhaps if China wanted to dial down its antagonistic relationships around the region, they could have done so. But instead, actually, they've augmented and boosted that. Taiwan feels more pressure. The South China Sea feels more pressure. India feels more pressure. Japan feels more pressure. So this is a moment when you got a new president coming in. China could have dialed down pressure a bit and given itself some breathing room, but chose not to. So I think you're going to see things picked up very much where they left off.
Right. All right. So talking about another issue domestically in the United States, which has massive ramifications as far as Indians are concerned, Yashwant, this issue of H-1B visas, this has been a contentious issue in the recent past as well, especially with the Trump administration's immigration laws and the kind of strong hand that Trump had with dealing with immigrants. So is that going to change now? And are Indians going to get a little more favor than maybe some of the others as far as these H-1B visas are concerned?
Frank, thanks. Can I also talk a little bit about the strategic
Absolutely.
relationship?
Please do.
I just wanted to bring up something that Biden did, which was really unusual during his campaign. The Biden campaign issued a very exhaustive paper on what its position is going to be on India, which is unusual. Presidential campaigns haven't done that. India would mostly be a paragraph in the party's platform, and that's been true for both Republicans and Democrats. So this time, the Biden campaign actually issued a paper on for Indian Americans, with a substantial portion of it devoted to ties with India. And there, he said, the campaign said very clearly that ties with India will get high priority, which is not unusual, which is not something very remarkable. But he also talked about how China will not, this administration will not stand for China bullying around in the neighborhood, which is given the context, quite significant. And it also pointed to that cross-border terrorism will not be tolerated, which is again a very clear signal to Pakistan. So those were two very strong signals that the Biden campaign sent, which was unusual because of the length to which they went about it. About H-1B, H-1B has been a problem for both Republicans and Democrats. Let's be very clear about this. While Indians have benefited from this, but there has always been, if you remember, Obama used to talk about how he wants to bring jobs back from Bangalore to Boston, and so there has been an issue about H-1B for a very long time. Politicians on both sides have felt it's been used to ship American jobs out through offshoring or outsourcing. And so while Biden has talked about dialing back some of the really egregious policies that Trump did on immigration, such as DACA, as I mentioned, and the travel ban stuff, but we haven't heard very much on the plans for H-1B, which Trump has been tightening through incrementally through executive orders, regulations, which don't require the administration to go to Congress. So H-1B is kind of changed in form and character a lot. So I would really like to see a very explicit statement from the Biden campaign, and now the administration transition team, if there is a plan for H-1B. But Indian companies for sure, and Indian students and professionals who tend to get picked up. 70% of all H-1Bs go to Indians, either hired in India or hired from American schools and colleges here in the US. So Indians clearly stand to benefit the most, and will be watching the administration's moves on H-1B if and when something explicit is done.
Absolutely. All right. Praveen, so, are there any areas of the relationship that need special attention, do you think?
This is the India-US relationship?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm an economist. I look at things from kind of the economics perspective. And on international trade, the one sort of significant feature of the Trump administration has been its very aggressive unilateralism, and very aggressive bilateralism, you could call it even. But in other words, they've sort of gone around the multilateral process. So where the WTO had a kind of very central position in the way that trade discussions took place in decades past, and where India felt it had kind of its own views that it could communicate or policy positions that it could influence through the WTO process. I think what you've seen with the Trump administration has been a kind of hollowing out of that, and U.S. taking sort of unilateral positions with respect to Mexico, with respect to Europeans, with respect to the Chinese, and with respect to India. So I think one, to the extent that we think of the U.S.-India trade relationship as being an important one, which it is for India and for the U.S., I would hope very much that one of the things that the Biden administration accomplishes is to work again with the multilateral institutions. The WTO currently is actually a mess. Various functions of the WTO have been virtually completely dismantled. The dispute settlement mechanism lacks any judges to adjudicate cases, in part because the U.S.'s opposition to the reappointment of judges and so forth. So the WTO is looking very weak at the moment and has been taking quite a bit of abuse over the last 4 years. I think sort of restoring the position of the WTO, continuing to engage India through for India to engage with the rest of the world and for the United States and likewise for the U.S. through the WTO would be a great thing. On the kind of the what's going on with U.S. trade in Asia, there were two major kind of trade agreements that we were discussing. One of these in the past, one of these was the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the U.S. very nearly signed until it backed out at the last minute. This was of some concern to India because India was not part of the TPP, and it was kind of a question of what the impact of the TPP would be. And now I think that question comes back to us. What if the U.S. reconsiders the TPP, wants to join the TPP? India will have to think again about what the implications of the TPP would be for India. And correspondingly, there was the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was an agreement involving the Chinese and India and Japan and so forth, which India walked out. And so I'm not sure what this kind of where we end up in terms of it with this dynamic. Is it going to be the case that as we move forward, India will have reasons to reconsider its position with respect to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership? It may not want to do so, especially given the current kind of political tensions, geopolitical tensions with the Chinese. But these are issues that I'm kind of genuinely curious about and would like to, I guess one would have to wait and see how these things play out. Both trade relations at the multilateral level, trade relations at the level of kind of particular international bilateral type trade agreements between sets of countries, which India is part of and is excluded from.
Absolutely. All right. Since we are here, then Richard, are we going to see a focus on on multilateralism going forward under the Biden administration? That is one. Secondly, of course, I told you I'm going to come back to this aspect of the Paris Climate Accord, the WHO, and the WTO, as well as Praveen has just raised. What's likely to happen there?
Yeah, Biden is very much an internationalist, long track record of working with international organizations and a desire to strengthen them. So I do think you're going to see a restoration in that direction. And then it does include, I think the United States will re-enter the Paris Accord and frankly, try to use international convention to try to get countries to strengthen their own commitments on climate change. And that's going to be an important building block for U.S.-India relations. Frankly, it was one of the strongest areas underpinning the relationship that Prime Minister Modi and President Obama were able to forge. And I think that Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, is going to be able to pick that up and run with it. India has a huge commitment to renewable energy, but having a tough time meeting that commitment sometimes. Can the U.S. partner? A lot of good things I think that could be done in the bilateral space as well. In terms of internationalism, then the question also comes down to how are we going to treat our partners too in some of the other tricky areas that have bedeviled U.S.-India relations. For instance, our unilateralist approach to Iran, the way that we really struck out on our own in terms of deciding what the future was going to be for Afghanistan. These are some other areas where I think India may be consulted more. The international community may have a bit more of a voice as the U.S. looks to take particular steps. And that's going to reduce some of those pressures on India that we created more indirectly because of the way that we approached certain other countries. I'd probably throw Venezuela in that list too. So I do think you're going to see a return to that. The question is, how much is the United States going to be embraced? Do they feel that this is a U.S. restoration to multilateralism for long term, or is this merely a blip until you have another candidate that's running for office that has a reasonable chance of getting elected that's going to do another about face? So it's going to take some time to rebuild that confidence, no matter how much we choose to engage early on.
Before I move on to Yashwant, since you brought up Afghanistan, that's an issue that I want to take up with you as well. There is a sense of fear really as far as New Delhi is concerned that the United States may cooperate further with Pakistan, considering what's at stake in Afghanistan. Do you see that happening, and should that be a concern for India?
I do see it happening. I don't think it should be a concern. I think the United States, there's very few proponents of a stronger, wider bilateral relationship with Pakistan. The relationship with Pakistan is important, but it's very utilitarian. It has a single purpose that we're really think about right now. When you think about the hyphen that we all were trying to smash out of existence 20 years ago, where we felt that we had to treat India and Pakistan with parity. If there's still those in Delhi that feel that we still have some inklings of that, there's such a long list now of things that we're doing with India, areas of cooperation, civilian nuclear cooperation, the kind of military technology, the new office we created at the Pentagon to expedite technology control. So the differentiation between the two from Washington is very stark. It's very clear. And I hope that's very clear from Delhi as well. So Pakistan will remain important for a single purpose. And I suspect that you'll see the United States continue to engage. But I don't think that it should cause any concern to reasonable souls in Delhi.
So there's nothing more to it, is what you're suggesting, and it's just a unilateral goal. Okay, Yashwant, as far as new avenues are concerned, what are some of the new avenues that India and the United States can probably take up and can take forward?
I think the initiative will have to come from India because Biden administration will be weighed down by priorities among which India is not at the top. So India will have to come up with a new set of things to do. But don't forget, running the relationship and taking care of what we already have on the table is going to be quite a lot in itself. And excuse me. And there is the Quad where things are happening. So. The list of things that India and the US are doing together. So I was saying the kind of list of things that India and the US are already working on is huge. And from cooperation on space, on water, on science, medicine. It's really difficult to think of a new thing to do, on a new area to look at, and especially when you have so much else to do now already and so much to take care of.
Right. Okay. Time now to get quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Praveen.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with all of what Yashwant and Richard have said. There's lots of good things already in place in terms of what the US and India are working on. I hope that going forward, there'll be greater integration on the international trade side, greater integration with respect to foreign direct investment. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I would argue even especially on the Indian side to encourage more FDI and so forth. But outside of that, I think things are in a good place. I think India has been less affected by President Trump's idiosyncrasies than some other countries have been for a variety of reasons that maybe we discuss on another show. But India's in a relatively good place, and I hope they just continue to strengthen this going forward.
Absolutely. All right, Richard.
Just one issue that we haven't talked about so far, Frank, which is CAATSA, potential sanctions. This will be, I think, the defining decision by the next U.S. administration. Will they choose to sanction India as India takes possession of the S-400 Triumph missile defense system from Russia? Right now, we're watching kind of a slow rollout of the United States trying to take different positions and setting lines in the sand against Turkey and seeing those kind of walk through right now. So I don't think that we're setting necessarily the best example in terms of how serious we look to apply these sanctions. But right now, there is a window to give India a pass by the sanctions. Is the window wide enough? Are we going to have to go back to Congress? And that's where some of the issues that Praveen and Yashwant had brought up on the contentious trade matters come up, because a lot of members of Congress, the last person they heard about India was an aggrieved company that felt that because of India's increased customs duties and other types of protections. So CAATSA, I think, is going to be the issue that defines the next president's position towards India. And right now, it's a bit of a ball in the air. We don't know which way it's going to land.
Right. And Yashwant, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I would urge patience. Give the new administration time. We tend to be judgmental. We will start saying, "Oh, the Biden administration is not as good for India as President Trump, or it would happen." I mean, so I suppose I would urge patience, and I agree with Praveen and Rick on all the issues that have been raised. Those will be on the table and they will be talked about, but. For us to we'll have to give them some time, and there will be remarks that will tend to get people really excited. But we should keep our eyes on the broader trajectory of the relationship, and not be jumping from one remark to another. And there will be plenty, and I'm sure there will be comments and not from the president, but from his cabinet, from his party, the progressives in the party. So we just need to give them time.
Okay. All right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that the Indo-US ties are in a good place. We need to be patient right now and give the Biden administration time to work out several of these issues that we've already spoken about. We need to focus on the positives. There has been a lot of work that has gone into the relationship over the last decade or so. Focus on the positives and take that forward. As far as the Biden administration is concerned, the primary focus, at least over the next few months, is going to be the domestic issues. And once those are sorted out, we can see something coming out as far as foreign policy is concerned. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.